Welcome to Solved, the political discussion show for people with attention spans and those hoping to grow theirs, maybe even for the first time. My name is Jay, and our other resident solvers are Amanda, Deon, and Erin, who will offer a greeting now.
Hey there.
Hello.
How's it going?
Collectively, we produce the venerable, indispensable, not to mention award-winning podcast Best of Left, where humans, that's us, curate progressive media on a chosen topic, creating episodes that are greater than the sum of their parts. On this show, we use those same curation skills to pull together stories and ideas that help us solve some of society's biggest problems, because if we don't tell you how to think, someone dumber on the internet will. Today, we'll be looking at some of the debates happening in society right now, and rather than try to solve those individual debates, we're going to tell people to shut up and realize that we're having the wrong debates altogether because our collective frustration should be aimed higher. And in fact, having many of the debates that we are is actually acting as not only a distraction, but also a sort of pressure release valve that prevents our collective problems from being addressed in better ways. So we're going to start briefly on the topic that inspired this episode. I was talking with a longtime family friend recently about their experience managing an office that is holding the ongoing debates, as many offices are, about returning to work post-COVID. And they're not even talking about fully coming back to work. They're just trying to up it from 1 day a week to 2. And it's causing a huge problem. And so there are lots of nuanced arguments on both sides about the benefits of people being in the office versus the benefits of staff having more flexibility in their schedules thanks to working from home, et cetera, et cetera. But we're not getting into those weeds. And I just want to pull on one of the threads, which is the relationship between working from home and childcare, because this one really stuck out as an example of having the wrong discussion. Because when we get caught up, like fighting in the weeds about whether employees should be allowed to manage childcare while they're also theoretically working, it gets harder to recognize that the only reason this debate exists is due to the lack of universal childcare access. And so that's just one example of how fighting about which crumbs can we get prevents us from seeing the bigger picture of how we could solve the problem so that we're not fighting over crumbs.
You know, as a child-free person, I always hesitate to weigh into these waters, but I saw so many people struggling during COVID, and foolishly, I thought this is one of the lessons we're going to learn after COVID is that we need universal childcare because our world is different. Parents are like overwhelmed, and if we especially if we want women to stay in the workforce and have the option to do that, then we're going to have to make some changes. And of course, we didn't learn that lesson in addition to many others. And so I think that people feel pretty pissed about their flexibility being taken away, but they, as we always say, are not aiming high enough to point to where the real problem is that other countries have been doing this or at least giving significant subsidies, and this is not revolutionary. And we should probably be doing this. And everyone acts like it's some huge hurdle that we just can't possibly imagine. And it's not, because there's roadmaps all over the place if we look around. So I feel for parents and I understand their anger and I understand why it's directed where it's directed, because as we say a lot on the show, when people feel disempowered to change things at a big systemic level, they go to their boss, right? Or they go to the lowest person that could possibly have any impact and try to make progress there because it feels more accessible. But what would actually benefit everyone collectively is if we made some big societal changes and decisions and moved forward.
An example of why companies, let's say, should not take on childcare responsibilities. When I first got hired on at corporate office, it was introduced that they had a on-site childcare facility. And I was like, wow, that is super awesome. One, convenient for the parents. Two, just like a really cool thing for this corporation to do. The reality was it wasn't accessible. It was more expensive than almost every single childcare facility in that particular area. And so the only people who could actually utilize it were very high up in the company, which then also laid bare the racial inequalities that existed within their corporate office.
Mhm.
So, like, it was a very nicely presented thing that when you get into the depths of it, like, it does not work because, of course, if you're looking for profits, you're even going to look at childcare.
One of the articles that we read about it, the person that was discussing whether or not they would have to get childcare for an at-home job, they said explicitly they couldn't afford it because it'd bankrupt me. And as the person who does have a child on this, we looked at daycare when our daughter was in daycare age, and I don't know how anyone who is not rich can afford daycare. It is prohibitively
Yeah.
expensive. Like you would be basically working to pay for daycare, which okay, if that's the point, then why would you even work? And there's also the aspect of preschool not being paid for in this country in most places. We were able to afford preschool at our elementary school. You do have to pay, it's not the same as the off-site private preschool, but there was a cost. Nominal, we could afford it. And the benefits that I got to see firsthand for all the kids that my daughter was in preschool with, once they filtered into kindergarten and first grade, the kids that did preschool were so far ahead of the kids that
Mhm.
didn't do preschool. We did preschool for 2 years, and these classes were fantastic and got to know some of the parents, and the kids were all great. And then got into kindergarten, and a bunch of kids who didn't have preschool just absolutely destroying classrooms. My
Mm.
daughter seeing behaviors she'd never seen before because she didn't know that was an option. And that
Right.
that's that's just something that would benefit everyone to have preschool be paid for by all of us. And we could all contribute much less than we all do individually because when you pool money together, it makes things easier. And that's a fundamental difference between what we're talking about and what people on the right want. Amanda brought up if we want to keep women in the workplace, X, Y, and Z. Well, they don't want to keep women in the workplace.
Right.
The right want women to be out of the workplace. They want
Yeah.
women to stay home, barefoot, pregnant, all that bullshit. And again, that's not good for society. It is better for society when women contribute to everything else in society instead of just child rearing. Because as we've seen, male dominated society is not the best way to run things. I know that the right will disagree completely, but I think you can look around and look at the evidence and say, hey, maybe we should do some things differently.
And Deon, you're talking about preschool and how important it is. This is why we have Head Start. I mean, it's not a preschool program, but it is to fill the gaps for low income families. Now, like we often talk about expanding Medicaid and things like that. We could expand Head Start and have preschool covered for everyone and have daycare covered for everyone. Like this is not a rocket science starting from scratch concept. It could be a thing.
Well, and just to go back to the point that Dion made about the article and how the person was expressing the financial aspect of it, we did not choose this article because it was just like such a great example of like how to respond. But one of the things that bothered me in the response to this person was that it didn't address the financial aspect, but it kind of compounded issues and talked about like, oh yeah, availability has been a huge barrier as well. And then like didn't offer any suggestions to someone of how to like work around the affordability issue. And like to myself, I got a little irked at that. And then I thought, well, what resources would they provide? There really
There
aren't a
aren't,
lot
yeah.
Yeah.
that you can do to make it affordable. So I was a little irritated, but also like it's definitely societal. And like that's why we can't look small. Like we gotta aim higher.
Yeah, we definitely didn't have an article with a progressive perspective that we're talking about here. I pulled one that was simply like a Q&A from a at-home worker with kids asking the managerial perspective on like, is it really legitimate for a company to try to force me to have childcare? And the managerial perspective was, Yeah, like that is actually pretty normal. But as Aaron said, they didn't give any resources for how to make that fit with reality. And that's the impasse. This is the immovable object and the other thing, whatever that phrase is, that there has to be a third way. And it's either a parent stays home and doesn't work, or the government steps in and provides a universal service that is desperately needed by many and would be hugely beneficial society wide. That's the choice, which is why it's so important to recognize that the debates in the weeds are a distraction. You can't blame people for like, look, this is the reality I live in. I literally have a job and a kid. This is my immediate reality that has a problem I need to solve. So, you don't blame people for trying to solve that problem. But what we are trying to emphasize is the need to not lose sight of the bigger picture at the same time.
Yeah, you can't just wait, however many years it would take us to to do that, but you got to start fighting for it.
Next up, separate topic, we're talking about gig workers. So not just at home, this is like the Uber driver, the DoorDasher, those people. And one of the debates within that world is about how these people should be classified. Should they be classified as freelancers or should they be classified as employees? And what is fundamentally behind that debate is about whether corporations should be on the hook for providing benefits. Employees have the right to benefits, freelancers do not. That is the core of it. Of course, what this debate is hiding is the bigger picture about how we need universal benefits like healthcare. So that's something we definitely can do. There might be some things that employees deserve as benefits that don't make sense as a universal nationwide program, but we definitely need to completely rethink how those are applied. The traditional employee model is just employer employee. The expectation, this hangover from decades ago when people kept the same job for a long time, is that you're in a relationship with the same company for a long time. The trend of people keeping the same job for a long time had already begun to slide when gig work came along. And now people are like free floating atoms, not connected to anything by any sort of firm bond. So we came across a discussion that is arguing for benefits that follow the person rather than the corporation. So a person could float from one job to the next, dealing with one corporation and then the next, often multiple corporations simultaneously, but their benefits are attached to them as opposed to dealing with different benefits from each individual corporation. So that's an interesting idea, and it is being tested. The Department of Labor provided money for grants to run test programs and see how that goes. But fundamentally, letting ourselves get trapped in the weeds of how to sort of patchwork something for people precludes the idea that, oh, maybe we need to rethink everything. The nature of work has changed so much that the nature of how we provide benefits needs to also profoundly change. And then, where possible, things like healthcare, that shouldn't even be related to a person's job in the first place.
I'm going to say something a little nitpicky, but I think it's relevant. They're calling this idea portable benefits. And as you said, like following the person around. And that is such a framework of the corporate world and not a framework of the fact that we're humans and like actually we're not the ones that float around. Like we are forced to change things in our lives because of the way our economy functions and the way corporations operate. And like it gave me a little bit of that ick. Like it's a buzzword that definitely caters to the corporate class. And I do actually think, like, it's probably one of those things that could be a first step towards showing how we could do something like universal programs on the scale. So I'm not, like, opposed to it. I just the wording bothered me a little bit. And, they do say in this article it could potentially lay the foundation for a nationwide benefit system, the study that or the test that they are doing. And there has been a conversation about gig workers where it's like you don't want the company to get off the hook because they definitely are trying to get off the hook to provide anything to their employees. They've been fighting it in court across the country to try to make sure that they don't have to provide benefits because their workers are not full-time employees, quote unquote. And there have been rulings in certain states that have changed that, and these companies get quite angry about it. But there has been more of a push to qualify these gig workers, like Uber drivers and delivery drivers and whatnot, as employees, at least of some kind. If you then say, well, we're going to have this portable system, then the companies are off the hook. They look at workers as just a means to an end and not as people. So how do we make sure that we're not only providing benefits to people and also making sure corporations don't continue the slide to looking at humans like they're worker bees and not caring at all about what they offer them?
I mean, one potential model, and we didn't dig into exactly how these test programs are being run, but one potential model is like workers' compensation programs that are run through the government but funded by corporations. So when a corporation has an employee, they pay into a fund that is managed by the government. And so employees who get hurt or unemployment benefits, I mean, that same thing is, you lose your job and you qualify for unemployment benefits, those are funded by corporations with employees, but it's administered by the state. So it keeps the relationship, but makes sure that those people's benefits are not then managed by corporations. That is definitely a bond we needed to break. And so those programs do run that way.
I think like what we're talking about really is human rights and how we can enshrine human rights for people and not make us have to be worker bees and working in a specific job at a specific time in order to receive benefits that every human being should receive, like healthcare.
Yeah.
Health insurance being tied to employers is a great benefit for employers and not employees. It is a good way to keep leverage on you because if for some reason something were to happen or you wanted to leave that job, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
You're going to get that COBRA insurance that's a
Mhm.
short-term 10x what you were paying coverage for the gap that you may be able to find a job in the interim. Like this is the bigger thinking that we're talking about here is that we have to separate industry from us being able to live as human beings. Fundamentally, like this is the big push that we've got to start making when we start thinking bigger. Maybe capitalism can survive this change, but I don't think so. I think what we are seeing is that capitalism has run its course. It has been dying for a long time, and it might die for another 50, 100 years. I've been working on the Best of the Left episode about how socialism works and how it could work in this country. And by the time this episode comes out, it might be out. But Richard Wolff was talking about how capitalism is dying and it's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen the next week. But eventually it will die because it's not a system that works for people. It's a system that works for a few people. A great profit for a few people.
Mhm.
I've seen some stats on the wealth share just over the last 40 years on what the top 10% earned over the last 40 years. It's almost 4 times as high as it used to be. Meanwhile, wages for the average person have stayed stagnant. Cost of everything has gone up 2 to 3 times. So we're making less. They're making more. This is not a sustainable system. So whether you're a gig worker or a regular employee, you're getting screwed by this setup as is. So we've got to find a way to detach a lot of these benefits, as we might call them, but really just things that people need to live from employment.
And I think the gig economy actually is the perfect example of dying capitalism. And like, I do think there's a layering that happens that kind of disguises all the shitty ways a gig job seems like there's a ton of benefits, but like it is all in sheltering. So, for example, you are utilizing your car in most of these gig economies. You're paying for insurance, you're paying for gas. So, those are expenses we know exist in life, but we don't realize how disconnected the company is from any of those responsibilities. Like, if you get into a car accident, it is your insurance that's getting dinged. You're responsible for the repairs, for everything. You're also probably making payments on the car because who can buy them outright? There's just so much layering that I don't think we dissect to see how expensive it is to be a gig worker. And then to consider that you don't have normal benefits, like you're gonna have to come out of pocket for healthcare expenses, things like that. And I'm not knocking any of the workers, obviously, but it is one of the shittiest categories to be classified as because there's so little benefit to it.
And the fact that it's a patchwork right now. It's state by state, and so you're lucky if you live in a place where you are being taken care of by some piece of legislation, and if you live in a place where you don't have any of that, good luck to you. That's why we need the federal programs.
Absolutely.
We tried to do some quick impromptu research on gig companies and whether they provide insurance to some degree at least. It's actually a little unclear. And the quick and dirty answer is holy shit, it's complicated. And it's definitely a weird patchwork. And some kind of do probably a little, and others definitely don't. And so, in the midst of trying to be as accurate as possible about the logistical hurdles involved in this weird new branch of the economy, we stumbled on like, oh, it's hugely complicated and not well designed because it wasn't designed. That's the whole point. When we offload the design of how our transportation or economy works to the absolute free market, you end up with a mess. Some will argue that's just part of the process. It's creative destruction, et cetera, et cetera. It'll all work out. But we are pointing out the downsides of that. And the little bonus to the world of specifically ride hailing apps, the story of their history starts with them coming on the scene and their whole business model. Like they pretend that their business model was about the ability to call a car from your phone. Their actual business model was creating a taxi service that would circumvent unionization that had already happened within taxi
Mhm.
companies. That's where their profits came from. They could pay drivers less because they weren't employees and they weren't unionized. That is where the actual value came in. They sold it to people with the use of technology. So good for them. But they came in, they created a taxi service that circumvented or flew directly in the face of existing labor protection laws covering taxi drivers. And here's the argument they made, more or less. Well, okay, maybe, but our service is so good, you're going to want to let us keep doing it. And here's why: we're going to be so much more efficient through the use of technology that it's going to reduce traffic in the cities and make people's transportation so much smoother that it'll save the cities money for having us here. So just let us do our thing. And so, of course, they got their wish in most cases. And time after time after time, there have been studies trying to see if any of that is true. And time after time, the answer is no. These companies come into town and traffic rates go up. So the article we found was about the study funded by the ride hail corporations themselves that still said that the same thing. Even when they funded the study, it still concluded that they drive traffic up in cities. So the point being, and how this fits into our overall theme of pressure release valves, is that their claim that they were going to reduce traffic and make transportation more efficient may have actually reduced city municipal efforts to build out their public transit, for instance. Well, maybe we don't have to invest in public transit because now we have ride hail companies that are coming in. Maybe that'll solve our problem for us. Turns out no. And in the meantime, we all lose out from the lack of public transit.
That's exactly where I wanted to go so badly. Like, trains exist. Trains
Mhm.
carry way more people than individual cars. You can get your Uber XL and get your 3 people in there versus a train that will do hundreds of times of that per hour more. And we've just gone away from it completely as even like a discussion in this country, that other countries are building out their public transit exponentially higher and faster than we are, and they don't have the same problems. I saw a video the other day. It was a guy who went to China, and he said, a lot of people say, like, you go to China and you hear, oh, they're living in the future. And he's like, I realized they're not living in the future. We're just living in the past, because a lot of the advances that we still have the same advances technologically.
Yeah.
They are gatekept. They are behind a paywall, and only certain people can afford them. And that's the way our society is working. Whereas other countries aren't releasing every new technological advancement to everyone in the country, but they are distributing it more evenly so that transportation becomes easier for more people, because they decide to make better public transportation as opposed to these individual personalized solutions where you can pick your preferred vehicle to ride around in. And it's cute, but it's not a solution to a societal problem.
On that note, I was talking to some people the other day, and they had ridden in a Waymo for the first time,
Mm-hmm.
and they were just describing their experience. And what I noticed as they described the reasons they enjoyed it, it was comfortable, there was like nice music playing, they didn't have to think about the traffic and all of it. And I was like, right, okay. But I was like, it's just like a private train car. And,
Yeah.
like, there really isn't a big difference. Like, you could be on a train car. Yes, there will be more people around you in a train car situation, but you can have your headphones on, you can listen to your music, you can read a book. Like, it's not that different. And I think, unfortunately, we think of these things as like the most amazing luxury is to be alone while traveling. That is the most amazing luxury, to not be with the unwashed masses. And that's a ridiculous way to build a society. And it also, as we always say, and Deon always advocates, like, it divides us and it keeps us separate in a way that then has downwind consequences about how we deal with each other in society. And so I heard that and I was just like, I just don't get it. Like, why can't we just have something that everyone, at least many more people, can access and have a very similar experience? Why is that so difficult? And why do we forget almost that that is something that we could have? And we focus instead on self-driving cars and getting rid of drivers because we don't want to deal with another person. It's like, I feel like this whole show is like a reminder, like, hey, by the way, there's another option.
I'm like thinking several different things. So let me see if I can weave them together. I was thinking about the study that shows people very much tend to identify or up themselves in the economic class. No one thinks they're truly lower working class. Everybody thinks they're like middle class, even if they're slightly above it too. So I was thinking about that and how trains feel very working class, whereas like having a driver seems like very upper class.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
So to me, I do think, and I know in other countries there may be a different framing of this, it might not necessarily be tied, but all of the objections and stuff still have to do with who gets access. So like expanding public transportation means, well, lower class people are now going to have access to other areas. Like, whereas if you get in your Uber and you make it more exclusive, we'll maintain that distance. But it's all that like elitism, yeah, I guess I would say, that Americans have. Like, they want to believe themselves to not be the person who actually does need the help. And like, we're going to get into tipping. And I would say that's very similar, that you don't have a lot of power in your everyday life. So this feels like something you can have power of, and something that makes you feel a little distance to like the realities of the fact that like the majority of people are struggling financially, but we like to play make believe. Put it on a credit card.
This is the land of dreams, Erin.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I guess my takeaway: make trains bougie. Like,
Right.
There, I think you're onto something. Actually, that reminds me of a story I heard a really long time ago. A South American city with a socialist mayor was talking about why they were building out a bus system and making the buses have dedicated lanes that individual cars were not allowed to go in. And so, first of all, his socialist argument was that the road space should be divided up not by vehicle, but by human. So, a bus that can carry 100 people should get 100 times more space on the road than a car that's only carrying one person or, four, maybe five at most. So that was the socialist argument for having dedicated bus lanes. Awesome, love it. But then the other thing he said was they were designing the bus system to feel like a high-end train system. So there were elevated platforms and the bus doors opened high. So you weren't just on the side of the road right near the gutter to then step onto a bus. You went to a station that had gates and you would be on an elevated platform and the bus would come along and you would enter it much more similar to how you would enter a train at a station. And the whole point was to make it feel higher class so that people would want to do it. It was all about tapping into that very real thing of like, well, I don't want to be the person who's doing the lowest, cheapest, least classy thing. And that's the bad rap that buses have. And so if you sort of elevate the experience of a bus, then you expand the number of people willing to take it. I thought that was totally great.
Mhm.
yeah, good point.
The other thing you made me think of when you said that everyone thinks of themselves as middle class, even if they're below or just a little above it. So I started the show talking about how we were chatting with longtime family friend, and another of that family friend's stories was about a very, very well off friend of theirs. So, like, family friend, probably making five figures. The friend of theirs bringing in many, many multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. That's that sort of discrepancy. And this friend talked about how we're all rich, like Americans, like we're all so well off. And so that's their way of admitting, like, yeah, I'm pretty well off. But like, really, when you think about it, like we're all doing so well,
Yeah.
globally speaking. And that was actually a new way of the rich making themselves sound not that rich. The more classic one I am familiar with is the like, I'm making a lot of money, but my expenses are so high, I'm really feeling strapped. But this one was new. It's the like, yeah, we're making a lot of money, but I mean, the difference between, $50,000 a year and $500,000 a year, I mean, like, really, when you think about it, we're all doing pretty great. It's like, wow, that's a great, great sleight of hand.
Well, that's this is the richest country on earth bullshit that we hear all the time. I guess that might be true technically, but that is not how it is distributed.
Yeah.
And speaking of the relationship between the rich and the poor, that brings us to the culture of tipping. So it's, I think, relatively well known in progressive circles that the origin of tipping in this country is super racist, but it also works to sort of maintain those hierarchies and keep down living wages, eliminate like predictability in wages for service workers, etc. And so it was born out of the post Civil War era. Essentially, employers were just like, well, a minute ago, all these people were slaves. I don't want to have to pay them. Maybe we could just get our clients or our passengers to tip them, and then we don't have to pay them. And so that was the origin of it. It also came over as a hangover from Europe, ironically, because Europe is super not into tipping to this day. It's probably infiltrating more as American culture spreads, as it always does. But in Europe, it's not like you need to pay a percentage of your bill. It's like, yeah, if you want to toss €1 on the table, whatever, it's fine. But like, the servers are getting paid a good wage and it's not really an expectation. Whereas in the US, it's like, if you don't tip your server, you're in favor of slavery because you know they're not getting paid anything. And so it's on you to pay for their livelihood, basically. It's a very different system. But I was saying that originally the idea came over from Europe because they were the ones with the aristocracy. And tipping was one of those cultural things where like rich people felt like it was fun to like toss money at poor people to show their wealth a little bit. Deon, you're a tipped worker. How do you feel about upholding the system of racism?
Well, I feel like I'm not upholding the system of racism. I am a part of the system of racism.
Right.
I've been a tip worker for I don't know how many years at this point, years and years and years. And I work at a place where I'm part of, I guess, in the service industry, I'd be part of the 1% probably because I have a house, I can afford a mortgage, I can survive, I have an income based on the prices of the food we serve at our restaurant. I have also worked recently, this last couple weeks, a friend of mine who used to be the chef at the restaurant that I currently work at has his own place, and he does something that most places don't do, but tips are pooled, and everyone that works from the dishwasher to the front of the house shares the tips. And that's something, if anybody I'm working with hears this, I've said this to your face many, many times, so I'll say it here if you hear this. I pushed for this a long time ago, that we should pool tips and share, and it should all be, everybody should get the same thing, because the way our restaurant works is the people at the front of the house, the servers, the bartenders may end up making way more than the people in the back of the house because they're getting paid a wage.
Yep.
And that's not typical in, I mean, I guess that's how it works most of the time. It kind of averages probably similar because most restaurant servers aren't really making that much money. I've fought for this, especially after COVID, because I thought this would be a great time, make a change. We're doing some weird stuff. Like, it'd be a good time to do that. But that's not how it worked because of the individual nature of this job, where you can make your own money and you can kiss the ass of the right person and end up getting tipped a lot from a rich person who likes to give you money. And that is a dynamic we have at the place I work at that is very uncomfortable. I don't like it, but it is the reality of how we make our money. And there is this aspect of it that you get to see it sometimes with people you don't really know. Like, they want to lord over you and give you money to feel some sort of power. That's kind of gone, like, over time, that kind of gets filtered out, and now it's more of a regular crowd, and it's just people you end up getting to know, people you become close with. This is a weird one. I'm actually in someone's will that I only know because of working at the restaurant, just because they become part of your family. Like, there's this lady who is like a surrogate grandma. I see her once a year. Her husband passed away years ago, and she doesn't get around as much as she used to, but every time I see her, she asks me how my daughter's doing. She said she does the math in her head because she remembers her birthday. She's this age, so she's in this grade. She wants to see pictures. That kind of thing is really cool. But that all could be done if on the menu we raise the prices 20% and we put, this is how much it cost, and that money is wages. That could all be done.
Right.
But that's not how we're doing it because of the culture. And I think it's the exact same thing going back to the bus thing. This idea that this is special, it's exclusive. I get to have some sort of power at the end of it. And yeah, it's a strange dynamic. It's never not strange. And it's normal, but it's still strange.
Yeah.
I worked back at the house at a very shitty restaurant that was cheap. And I will say 100% the power dynamics that existed there were people who did not have power in their lives, who came to the restaurant and wanted to exert what little power they had.
Exactly that.
But our servers deserved every cent that they ever got. They were the hostess servers, and they also had to help with dishes. Like, our restaurant was exploiting every single person, and including back of the house. So there became, and like, this is my point about tipping. Yes, it's not right, but it also creates conditions with workers where there's a lot of like hostility and feelings that exist.
Mm-hmm.
So like being a cook, it was known that the servers would make more money and have to work less than you did. Again, you're pitting against one another. Everybody was wronged in this situation. But like it created an environment where also because our servers were dependent on tips, everybody was at their beck and call, essentially. Like everything was in service to make sure that when the guests left, no matter how awful they were, no matter how awful they treated anyone on staff, that they were happy so that they would leave a tip and our servers could pay their fucking bills. Like it's so awful and toxic. But again, and then there's the hostilities between workers because it's seen unfair by everybody for different reasons. All of us were being exploited. And like that was the reality.
Yeah, I mean, when the $15 minimum wage fight started and I saw all this hostility from business owners, I've said this for years and some people get irked about it, but if you can't pay your staff a living wage, you didn't do your business plan right. If you're depending on the customer to pay and that be separate from your business costs, you're not a good business person. Walmart, depending on social services to provide benefits to their employees, means like they're not good at business. And I think we have given people a pass for so long because this is just what we have accepted to be okay. But really, it's just a way for businesses to avoid actually paying what the cost of doing business is. And we've been saying that's okay for a very, very long time. The part of that story about tipping in Europe that I find really interesting is Americans rejected tipping. This is from a different article, so I apologize. I went on a little bit of a rabbit hole, but they rejected tipping initially because they thought it was un-American and classist. And they did not want to bring that culture from Europe over here. And like then around the 1930s-ish, it really, really took hold as something that everyone understood, like 15% at least when going to restaurant, that kind of stuff. But there was this shift around the turn of the century from that's un-American. And like, I think they said even, was it Woodrow Wilson or somebody had come out during his campaign and said like, I don't tip, like that's un-American. And then they won the presidency and they were kind of alluding that that was part of it. So like there was this strange culture, and it's deeper than that. It has racism entrenched because of course it does, because this is America. And so like part of it was we don't like tipping and we don't want to tip because we don't want to pay Black workers. That was another subtext of being anti-tipping. So it's not just clean and clear, but the fact that there was an argument for it being classist and un-American at all is pretty fascinating to me. And like I hadn't heard that the first time around when I heard this origin story initially. So we've made a decision in this country. We've made a decision that there are certain kinds of workers where if you own a business and you have to have employees, you don't have to pay those workers as much. Like that's bizarre. And we should be talking
Yes.
about that as bizarre and strange and means you are not doing it right.
Yeah. And fast forwarding to modern days, some restaurants have experimented with banning tipping. And it says right on the receipt, like, we pay better wages and we've decided collectively as a restaurant to not allow tipping. Please don't tip. And people get pissed. They hate the idea of not being able to tip, and I'm sure it's very multifaceted and complicated emotionally for them. And part of it is like, but I'm an American and I feel the need to tip, and you're telling me I can't. And that's in conflict with everything I feel about how I'm supposed to act in this scenario. And then, of course, there are the people who are like, don't take my power away. Tipping is a form of exerting power over people.
Mhm.
And people who think of tipping that way really, really don't like it when you tell them that their power is going to be taken away. No, sorry. Your servers are going to get paid just as much whether or not you personally like them. Whether you personally think that they did a good job, they still deserve the wage that we're paying them. And there are already mechanisms in place for people who are bad at their jobs to not get paid. It's called getting fired. Like, that is how the system is supposed to work in theory. And tipping has perverted it to the point that individual customers think that they're supposed to have the power to decide how much an employee gets paid for the service they're providing. It's gross, but it's so deeply embedded in culture now that people don't know how to handle switching back. We need something beyond just businesses changing their policies. We need like a cultural shift that would probably come with it being a major, one of those national conversations sort of things. Like that's what it would have to be to start changing hearts and minds in addition to policies. And
Mhm.
we've been seeing these articles for at least a decade. This is bad. Everything about it is bad. We need to stop right away. So maybe eventually we can build up enough steam in that direction.
I just want to say it was Howard Taft, just to correct myself. They called him a patron saint of the anti-tip crusaders. Yeah. When he was running president. But I also, on the note of culture, I think we'd be remiss, and Deon probably has more insight in this, when states have evaluated laws about banning tipping, there has been an outcry from the service industry, and like rightfully so, right? Because like they are worried that they will make less money. That is absolutely a valid concern. And I don't blame anyone for being concerned about that and feeling that way. And in some cases, it's probably going to be very true, like that's probably going to be the reality. So I don't necessarily have the right answer, but I think part of it is a culture change. The only thing that would really start to change that on both sides would be a major shift in culture and rejecting the idea of that business model as valid.
Well, luckily, we had a long campaign where Donald Trump ran on the idea of no tax on tips,
Yep.
that this kind of became a conversation a little bit, to the point that several people who clearly didn't know me very well asked if I was happy about that and was probably going to vote for Trump because of it. Like, you're an idiot.
Mm.
That's such a dumb thing. And the bill has shown exactly what I thought it would show. Like, of course, this isn't a real thing.
Is
But it did bring it back into like kind of a national conversation. And I think once people start thinking that servers aren't paying taxes on tips and now they're paying taxes, it might force this kind of reassessment, not from a place of this is unfair for servers, we should do this because it would be good for servers, but rather this is unfair. The servers are making all this money and not paying any taxes, and I'm a hardworking American paying my taxes.
Yeah, that is more likely. I mean, one of the few things I've read about that, sort of the fallout of that policy, is the absolute possibility that people just won't tip as much. Like, well, if you're going to save
Oh, yeah.
20%, 30% in taxes on your tips, then I'm going to tip you 20 or 30% less. How about that? Like, great.
And that has been happening, like, especially since 2020, and there's been, like, a kind of explosion in tipping at every interaction you have. People are tipping less because they feel overburdened by the tipping. There's a Pew Research study on it a couple of years ago.
And cost of food have gone up astronomically over the last 5 years. Astronomically. So at some point, people who go to restaurants and want to go to restaurants because there is a value to restaurants. We have too many in America. I think that it's become more of a norm for people to go out to eat way more than it used to be. There are a lot of restaurants that are struggling because of just the cost. But we're going to see a point where the cost of things is too much for people to bear. It's just going to collapse at some point because restaurants already, the justification for paying servers half of minimum wage is that, their margins are so thin, it's hard to make money anyway, which is true to a point. But then, like Amanda was saying, your business model sucks. If you can't afford to pay people that work at your restaurant, your business model is not good. And eventually we are going to get to that point, just because if things keep going up in price and wages stay stagnant, and then there's this added layer of envy, jealousy, hostility towards your wait staff because they're supposedly not paying taxes, this is going to create a whole new issue for restaurants that who knows what's going to happen, but it's not going to be good for anybody, really.
Yeah, it's anti-solidaristic I don't know if that's a real word, but it is,
Divisive.
it is opposing solidarity
There you go.
between people. It is creating a new
Anti-solidarity.
divide for people to get mad at each other about.
Absolutely.
So speaking of getting food to people, that brings us to this article from The Guardian. Expanding food banks is no substitute for tackling poverty. And the one quote I pulled from it says, "We need real long-term solutions based on rights and social justice. Only governments can guarantee these rights. Adopting a cash-first approach to food insecurity is vital to ensure people can access income before charity, but equally vital is the prioritization of systemic changes to truly tackle poverty and inequality." End quote. And that was from a food charity organization that's like, we would prefer to not have to be here. Food literally only provides a temporary relief from hunger, which is vitally important. But could we get deeper? Could we tackle some sources of this problem instead of depending on food charities run by volunteers to make sure people aren't dying of hunger? Again, dig deeper, aim higher, choose your metaphor.
I've been thinking about how we're having conversations about Trump's chaos and how it's creating like that sense of normalcy where like you're still kind of going about your thing.
Hypernormalization.
Yeah. That's kind of how I think about like food banks and stuff. It is normalizing something that is atrocious in, quote, the wealthiest nation in the world, right? The reality is we do have people who are hungry. We have people who are experiencing houselessness. Like, how does that exist? And like shelters, food banks trying to kind of one, move people about in areas that are like more acceptable for them to be at. And two, oh, but we're doing something about it. Like there are food banks, there are shelters that they can go to, which not enough. And again, does not actually solve the problem. Just puts like a patch on it for whatever amount of time. I mean, we eat 3 times a day. That's a normal amount to eat. So just atrocious. Yeah.
I can't even recall if I'd had this thought before. It feels like it should be an old thought, but we've brought up the idea of it, the US being the richest nation in the history of the world a couple of times today, and it finally clicked that we all say that pretty regularly as an argument for why we should be better.
Mm-hmm.
And I hadn't really thought of it in the reverse, that that is absolutely something people say to emphasize how right they are to think that poor people are immoral.
Yeah.
Because in the richest nation in the world, being poor is even more shameful than if we weren't the richest country in the world. Like, such a lack of structural analysis behind that. And obviously it's just like a desire to look down on people and then work your way backward to a rationalization for it. I don't know that that had clicked for me, but that is pretty gross.
And it could be a reasonable thought until you spend, 10 seconds thinking past that. Because as you said, that like completely negates what access even looks like. Because in a country where you can have access to all this wealth, you don't have any. So what does that say about you? It ignores like what true access looks like and all the systemic ways that we take power and opportunity away from people.
I'm just going to shout out real quick, Poverty by America by Matthew Desmond. That's a good book on this very topic.
We don't seem to really agree as Americans what government is for, number one, because it seems like for this particular administration, the federal government is for bombing people, jailing people, and redistributing taxes to already rich people. And we also don't think about what capitalism is and why it is called capitalism. It is people who have access to capital being able to turn that capital into more money. And in a country where it is so divided, where there's so much wealth inequality, there are people who are born with capital. They are capitalist. And there are people who are born without capital. You are not a capitalist. You are a part of a capitalist system, but you are not a capitalist. And it's going back to the, thinking you're a part of a different class than you are. A lot of us, people have described themselves as capitalists, that no, you're a worker. Like, you work in the system of capital. That's not your job. Like, when people describe, the self-made billionaires like Jeff Bezos, who got a small loan of $200,000. Do you have access to $200,000 loan from anyone? Do you know an amount of people that could get you $200,000 today? No, a very small percentage of the population can. And that's not a loan. That's just a rich guy getting money from rich people. And that's how this system works. It's not designed for a food bank to get you through for a little bit so that you too can become the CEO of Amazon. That's not how any of this shit works.
But best believe, if you did go from a food bank to a CEO, we are going to tout that as the standard.
Yeah,
Everybody
you
should be
should do
able to
that.
meet
Yeah.
that bar.
Why didn't you
Like,
do
look
it?
at this person. Yep.
Yeah, one of my favorite's not the right word, but videos from my long history of paying attention to politics, and this one might date back nearly all the way, more than 15 years probably, was Craig T. Nelson, the guy who played Coach on Coach way back when, was like on Fox News complaining about the undeserving poor, basically.
We are a capitalistic society. Okay, I go into business, I don't make it, I go bankrupt. They're not going to bail me out. I've been on food stamps and welfare. Anybody help me out? No.
Nobody helped us. I was like, how
Yep.
how does someone even become an adult? And
Yeah.
the talking about using your identity to make your point, as we discussed in depth in our previous episode, like, how do you live a life of poverty where you are benefiting from those programs and make that argument and not realize what you're saying? So, speaking of people being in dire straits, our next topic is the horrors of GoFundMe, meaning the horrible nature of the need for people to lean on GoFundMe for whatever disaster they are facing. So, the first one we're talking about is natural disasters. And so, like, in the wake of Hurricane Helene, seeking to make Biden look bad, Trump, this article says, quote, launched his own official response to the disaster by setting up a GoFundMe page as an alternative to federal relief measures. To date, that's raised over $8 million, about 100 times less than FEMA itself had spent on that disaster as of January 2022. And Trump promised to donate to it. Obviously, he didn't. But
Yeah.
the article goes on to say that, quote, there's two interesting takeaways in those numbers. One, they indicate the vast spending necessary in response to big disasters. Private funding efforts, even the most well-organized or most visible, can never hope to match that scale. And two, once you dive into how that money was spent, you start to understand why public funding, with all of its transparency and tracking and rules, is necessary. End quote. And so it goes on to talk about how FEMA funds obviously are spent with oversight and transparency, whereas Trump's GoFundMe money was distributed to evangelical Christian churches who could spend it as they saw fit, which you can imagine how that goes. But at the very least, it inserts an element of doubt about, are they going to disperse those funds with absolutely no judgment or sleight of hand requirements that you come to their church service so they can try to convert you? Like, you just don't know. And that's the point of having a government agency do something like that. It's like, are you living in the country? Great, you qualify for services. That's how the government works. You get a church involved, people start having questions.
I was thinking about the floods in Texas and the video that is going around of the town officials, local town officials from a couple of years ago saying how they do not want to accept federal money because Biden is president and therefore that makes the federal government evil and villainous, and they were legitimately talking about returning the federal money. That was the conversation they were having because some didn't want to take federal money from a Democratic president's government. And they didn't return it. They decided to use it for a police emergency response radio system. And I watched those videos and I looked at those people and I'm hearing what they're saying. And like, look, it's a fever. Like I don't know how else to really describe it. But it is also the federal government, especially agencies like FEMA, used to be seen differently. It wasn't that FEMA turned into a villain when a person from a different party became president. And that shift in our political discourse means that now everything is reevaluated on this polar level. And people are dying because of that. And I think that the turn to GoFundMe, which they go in detail about these people who were hit during Helene, and now Texas, they are in a vulnerable position and don't realize that our political discourse is putting their lives at risk. And I feel for them. Like, I actually have a lot of sympathy for the predicament they have kind of put themselves in, but that our whole, like, discourse has. And I can't imagine that people aren't waking up a little bit to, "Oh, right, like, it's better if the things that we have, the good things that we have in our society are just stripped away from political parties. If we do have some things here that are just this is the service they provide, whether it be Social Security, FEMA, etc." I'm just like I'm thinking about what is going through the minds of those people right now as their world views are crashing into each other.
Well, they live in a constant state of cognitive dissonance. Like to be that, to feel that. Like there's some videos going around of it may not be the same woman, so I don't want to link to it
Mhm.
or say what the video is, but a woman talking about, haha, you're going to Alligator Alcatraz and I'll wear Alligator Alcatraz gear if I want to. And then a very similar looking woman, I don't know if she's the same woman, but talking about, oh, they won't help us. We need these funds. We're just, I think it's Henderson
Yeah, I've
County.
seen.
They don't care
Mhm.
about us. And it's this constantly being sold anger at the undeserving poor. They don't deserve these funds. And it goes back to racism again, because the whole reason we don't have nationalized healthcare in this country is because someone my skin color or darker might get it too.
Yeah.
That's exactly why. And when these events actually happen to them, then they can see for a second, probably a fleeting second. I don't think there's going to be a wake up that maybe we needed this, but I don't think they're going to make the connection that the reason they don't have as much help as they're getting is because the party that they are voting for fundamentally does not believe that the government is supposed to do those things. They want to outsource this to GoFundMe because someone can make a profit on the back end of taking XYZ percentage off the top, as opposed to what government is supposed to do.
Mhm.
Government just fundamentally is just a giant pool of money that is distributed to help the people that live in the
Right.
country, right?
Or they
That's
want to
what it
push it
should
on the
be.
states. That's
Right.
the other.
Now push it on the states. And that's where this is personal to me, because I looked this up. In 2011, my hometown, Joplin, Missouri, got hit by a tornado. The seventh most fatalities in a tornado in the country. I think it was the most expensive and might still be the most expensive. So I looked it up. $2.8 billion worth of damage was done to the city of Joplin. Population at the time was like 55,000 people. So 55,000 people, $2.8 billion worth of damage. The state of Missouri's budget in 2011, 2012 was $23.8 billion. So if you push all that onto the states, an event that catastrophic, and there's going to be private insurance and there's going to be a lot of money that comes in because of private insurance, but it's not going to cover $2.8 billion worth of damage. So there has to be some help somewhere. And if that's supposed to come from a state budget that was only 23, like we're talking about a huge percentage of the state budget. And that's just that one town, that
Yeah.
55,000 people in that town were affected. Not to say anything else about what the state is supposed to do the rest of the year. that's not how any of this works. The state of Missouri couldn't do that by itself. It didn't have to. Luckily, like, my wife is from a smaller town in Missouri that had a tornado that did much less damage financially, but did a lot of damage to the town. And we actually drove through her town fairly recently, and the tornado that hit her town was even longer ago. And I said, man, this town looks like shit. And then she pointed out, this is where this building used to be here, this building used to be here, this building used to be here, because there wasn't really that much money because it's a smaller town and
Yeah.
it didn't get much news coverage. Whereas the disaster that happened mine, Obama came to my town, I think 3 times,
Mhm.
and FEMA was there, and there was all kinds of money influx. There's a park that looks better than it ever looked before the tornado, and that is because of federal funding that helped make things better. They are
Right.
constantly doing, to this day, work in an area to reduce flooding and fix drainage because of money that came from that. Like, that money is still being used to improve the town. And that's what it's for. And none of us asked for it. None of us did anything special to get it. None of us did anything bad to not deserve it. It just was what happened in this place. And that should be the baseline. That's it.
Mhm.
So there's 2 more major problems with depending on something like GoFundMe instead of the system that Deon is describing. The first is that FEMA has rules, which is part of what's good about them. And they have rules about how if you go privately fundraising to support yourself in the wake of a disaster, FEMA is not then going to come in behind that private fundraising and also give you money for that same stuff. So if you raise money privately to try to fix your destroyed house or your car or something like that, you will then be ineligible for FEMA funds for that. So you're likely to earn less from GoFundMe. Maybe you'll get it a little bit faster, which is why people consider doing it. But that system being there, like, that's why we're calling all of these things pressure release valves. There's a reason why people gravitate towards something
Yeah.
that, like, might be a little bit faster, might be a little bit more convenient, but ultimately creates bigger problems down the road. The other major one is that there's a study, the New York Times wrote about it, about how the amount of money you're able to generate on GoFundMe largely has to do with how rich you already are. Because wealthier people tend to have larger networks, and those networks are full of people who have more money that they're willing to give. And so the more money you already have, the more you're likely to generate from GoFundMe, which is completely at odds with how FEMA would run things, where they just actually give people the money based on the need. And so when you combine all of that, like, it's an absolute disaster. And this article we've been referring to concludes, quote, "Is that Helene GoFundMe an indication of what disaster relief might look like in the future? If so, it's not an encouraging one. With hundreds of times less funding, limited coordination, and zero accountability, there's also a chance a much needed offer of help may also be conditioned on adherence to a specific religious doctrine," end quote. And that is absolutely where we're headed, because they're going beyond cutting FEMA funding. They're actively advocating for doing away with it entirely. And
Yep.
I mean, the whole system is built to make people desperate and helpless so that they will be grateful for the few crumbs they might be able to get. And uh, the only way that this is possible is that Republicans have been demonizing government for so many decades that people believe it and think, like, yeah, maybe it'll be better. Maybe it'll be more nimble. Like, you can get money faster through GoFundMe. That'll probably be better. Well, wait and see.
Another huge gap in going the GoFundMe route versus FEMA is also the coordination of funds. Like, it makes sense that if you have 100 private fundraising efforts, like, the money is not going to be spent in more of a collective way than if you have a government agency who, one, has been trained in disaster preparedness and how to distribute funding and what to prioritize and all the things we would want them to consider.
Right. Infrastructure
like,
being a huge one.
Yeah. And That's not going to happen if we just depend on the individualized approach.
Yeah.
Just going back to what is the function of government? It is distributing these funds equally, as efficiently as possible to the most people that need it as possible. And the way that the Republican Party views the government is a tool for punishment and making rich people rich. I saw this recently. I don't remember exactly what the numbers were, but the new ICE budget in that bill that just passed is more than it would cost to end homelessness in this country.
Yep.
And if a budget is a statement of your values, I don't know what could state values more than that. And we have to fight that. And we have to have people that are willing to fight back against that. But the problem is, like what you were talking about with GoFundMe, is the way it's distributed is, if you have more money, you're able to make more money as a politician. And the Democratic Party does this, is if you have access to more people that can donate to your campaign, you are more likely to win. So you are already probably in that class that does benefit from the system as is if you are in government, even if you're a Democrat, especially if you're Republican, but even if you're a Democrat. So we have a bunch of people who do not understand that this is not the right way to go. It doesn't benefit the most people. It only benefits people like you.
Which brings us to the final topic, which is the one that is called for most in progressive circles, is the need for universal health care and the pressure release valve, which is such a double-edged sword that it is tragically necessary for people to use, again, GoFundMe to try to pay for their medical debt, but is also obscuring the unbelievably dramatic need for a complete overhaul of our, and I am one who absolutely endorses the idea that it is wrong to call it a health insurance system. We do not have a health insurance system. That implies some sort of design, some sort of idea. What we have is an accidental patchwork that came from no one's brain. No one thought, let's design it this way. It happened by accident, and we ended up with an absolute mess that doesn't even serve the needs of people who can access medical insurance, and obviously absolutely doesn't serve the needs of those who cannot. So MIT is writing this article, How GoFundMe Perpetuates Myths of Merit and Deservedness. So within the context of the conversation about the horrors of having to fundraise for your own medical payments, this article is analyzing the sort of deeper roots of how people think about the deserving poor and merit and all of these things that go into figuring out, consciously or unconsciously, whether you think, well, should I donate to that person's GoFundMe campaign? Do they deserve my money? Questions that shouldn't even be part of the discussion and wouldn't be in a universal healthcare system. So it says, quote, sites like GoFundMe have become powerful social arenas where ideas of goodness, merit, and deservingness are taken up, scrutinized, and circulated. Crowdfunders appeal to these ideas and they use campaigns to reaffirm their own identities as good people and upstanding citizens. Just to give a sense of the social dynamics that immediately come into play when a person finds themselves in need, but digs deeper, goes into the history a little bit of how meritocracy and ideas of the deserving poor date back centuries. It says, quote, if meritocracy is a relatively recent myth, the myth of the deserving poor is a much older one. Political philosophers have long debated to whom society owes forms of social support. As early as the 17th century, poor parishioners in England were given badges to wear in exchange for social support under the Elizabethan Poor Laws. These were intended to elicit shame and deter a sense of entitlement among the able-bodied poor, end quote. Call me crazy, but I think when you start making people wear badges, it doesn't traditionally end well.
No.
That's a bad way to go. And then it just leads to this like circular reasoning where in our capitalist, richest country in the world sort of mentality, the idea is that if you're poor or in need, then you're almost de facto immoral. And if you're immoral, then you don't deserve help climbing out of the poverty, which is the evidence of your immorality. And you just go around and around and around. And so that's why poor people don't deserve help. And so the only ones who do are the ones who aren't poor and have suffered some tragedy that is definitely not their fault. And they can show in the story they write about themselves on GoFundMe that they are good, upstanding people who deserve the charity of others.
And that's the thing. Like, we've turned it into a marketing contest. And that's gross. It's the lightest word I could use. I, as everyone has, see a fair amount of GoFundMes. I think that the thing that strikes me is the way in which people ask for money is always like this article's description. Like, I've never seen it another way. It is always like, they're good people, they're good parents, they've done everything right, is like the constant refrain. It's almost a template at this point. And then, this article is talking about like the pictures that people choose and how they're like the, really beautiful family photography shots to make sure everyone knows they're like a good family. And because they're beautiful in these photos, that means they're a good family. Like, it's really, the underlying messages there are quite disturbing. And what it was making me think is like, the people who are going to need the most help can't afford family photos. That's just not even remotely in their budget. And the people who can't afford it the most, they're more likely to be working at a job where they get injured and don't have any sort of recourse for losing wages or needing medical care. We live in a structure, whatever it is, maybe it's not a system, some kind of structure that definitely makes it so that everyone is suffering, like, up to a certain income that is quite high. Like, there are a fair amount of people that are suffering even if they make better than poverty wages or even middle class wages. But the only ones who get assistance are the ones who actually had something to begin with and might lose it all. And that's just another layer of this whole thing.
You guys remember in school the fundraisers where you would sell cookies or chocolate or whatever, all that stuff?
Mhm.
Yep.
In one of my classes, I remember distinctly we had prizes for whoever sold the most. And I thought I was doing a great job. Went around all the houses in the neighborhood and didn't get anywhere near to the first. Like, oh man, these kids must have been working so hard and going to so many doors to get all these cookies sold. And now
No.
realizing, like, oh, they just had super rich parents who had rich friends who
Yep.
took their little flyers and they bought as many, like, they didn't actually do anything. And that's how this all works. That's how GoFundMe works. That's how most things in this country work. You just need to know rich people. You need to be born near, by, yourself rich. And that's how you are part of the meritocracy. You were born that way. And I'm sure there's outliers. I'm sure. I think that's why a lot of professional athletes get a lot of hate, is because for the most part, that is actually a meritocracy. That's just the way it is.
Right.
You work the hardest, you have the most physical ability. We're born that way in a lot of ways, but it's not exactly the same. And I think that in this society, a lot of those people in sports that earn a lot of money are Black, and that causes this discomfort. Like, how could they really be deserving? Because it doesn't fit, right? And that's why we need to get rid of that bullshit idea of meritocracy. In one of the articles we read, I guess I didn't know this, but the idea of meritocracy was used sarcastically. It was
Yeah, it was
created
never
as,
intended
it's just
to
the
be.
same bootstraps bullshit, like that now that we use as a real thing. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Meritocracy was used to point out that the people in England that were in the upper class were always in the upper class. They didn't get there because they tried.
It was satire.
And we've turned these nonsense myths into a way a society is supposed to function. And
Yeah.
it's ridiculous.
Deon, did you just have the realization about the
Oh yeah,
cookies
absolutely.
live
I
on
just had to,
air?
like, it just popped into my head as we were like, oh
Wow.
my God, that whole thing. Because
Are you doing
I
okay?
never,
Like,
what's
do,
that?
do you need a minute? Do you-
I need to go find the kid that won the award and punch him in his face because I wanted to at the time and I didn't do it. But now I would be okay and justified because you didn't actually work. I did.
Is it affluency? Is that the other one that was made
Yeah.
up and kind of
Affluenza.
said with the
Yeah.
affluenza? That was it. That was what I was trying to think of. That's a very kind of similar origin. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, unfortunately, I have direct experience with GoFundMe. I had a family member who got cancer when they were 25, and they were part-time in the medical field, so they didn't have insurance, or actually they did, but it was through Obamacare. Woo woo. And there were a bunch of surgeries that like went with the cancer. So they came short on some funds, had some friends who, with the best of intentions, decided that they were going to do a GoFundMe account. In doing that, they completely did the same thing almost that I'm doing in setting it up, is like padding it with these extras of deservingness, as if everybody doesn't deserve to have their medical needs met, but also revealing like super personal details about the medical situation that person was barely comfortable sharing with like close family members, let alone an entire group of people that was then shared with people we went to high school with, people in the area that we grew up in. And it was a lot of exposure. And then like it kind of puts that person in a really awkward situation where they are essentially like having to beg for money in order to not be in huge mounds of debt. But like there's no dignity in that.
Yeah.
And I think that's what all of these stories are. Like there's not a lot of dignity, even if you end up being the winner. And this family member, they kind of won. They got most of their medical expenses covered. By no means rich or having connections with affluent people, but according to the GoFundMes that I've seen and the reporting on it, they quote won the system. And it's still like, I mean, as a human, it's demoralizing. Like it is just not a compassionate system for someone who's already having to go through treatment, who's already battling, you know, feelings of inadequacies and things like that, of like their body failing them, and to add the layer of like money and the demoralizing aspect of begging. It just,
Yeah, and the element of describing how these campaigns have to be written and how they're padded with like, this is a good person and like, no, trust me, they deserve it. All of that, like an example of a debate that would be horrible to even try to have and would be an absolute distraction is trying to argue like, we should be better than that. People shouldn't have to prove their worthiness. You should donate to a campaign even if they didn't present themselves that way. That is number one, completely missing the point, as is obvious. And number two, actually goes against human psychology. Like, if someone ran a campaign and they didn't do that, they definitely would earn less. It's completely irrational for someone to not write a flowery, I'm the most deserving victim in the history of the world kind of a GoFundMe page, because that is how humans judge each other. Like, that's the whole point. And so fundamentally, that is why it cannot be a system where there is any judgment involved. Literally,
Yeah.
like the government should be running it based on need, actual circumstances, cost of medical care, etc. The end. Not how are your ethics? Are you an upstanding citizen? Like, that cannot be part of the calculation. And what this I think relates to is how even putting positive frames on a toxic system don't help the system and perpetuate the toxicity. So this article talks about how GoFundMe as an organization like tries to uplift positivity. They try to, describe, well, and the campaigns are always describing people as like hardworking, breadwinner, hero, super mom, that sort of stuff. But then the platform itself, like, you can imagine the normal humans trying to do good working at GoFundMe. You can imagine them like, how can we say positive things? Like, let's uplift great people doing great things. And the article says GoFundMe itself reflects this rhetoric by highlighting the work of GoFundMe heroes and kid heroes. Yet, this rhetoric excludes a primary way that crowdfunding is used by people seeking help for themselves in desperate circumstances. End quote. So, like, even in a world where you're trying to show GoFundMe users as like super deserving and that you should support them, this is great. Like, you can't help but end up describing kind of the more deserving and the less deserving. Oh, you're running a GoFundMe campaign, but it's just for yourself. That's not quite as good as the people running a GoFundMe campaign because they care about some issue and they want to help in that way. Even when trying to do good, you do bad. Even when trying to frame things in the positive, you then create the negative in its shadow. And so, like, the evidence of the need to get rid of this entirely could not be more clear. And so I'm just going to read the conclusion of this article that says it as well as I would have. It says, quote, "When health relies on the charity of a digital crowd, it creates and exacerbates deep inequalities and undermines claims to more universal, rights-based systems of healthcare. As Ralph Nader argues, a society that has more justice needs less charity. Crowdfunding shows that the inverse of this statement is also true. More charity means less justice." And then finally it says, quote, "The inequalities of crowdfunding act like toxins that affect all of us, our health, our sense of what we owe each other, and our own visions for the future." End quote. Aim higher.
Yeah. We're also losing our community through these things. So, you know.
When you kind of end up preying on them a little bit. I mean, just thinking about that family member, the people who were giving money didn't have a lot to spare. Like, it wasn't people who were super affluent. They were living mostly paycheck to paycheck and, $25 here, $50 there added up. But like, because we're not using the government for the things, like, we're reliant on community. And again, like, they don't have the social safety net. Everybody is living under being in need in some capacity.
So to end on a lighter note, I really appreciated the good folks over at Dropout TV. It's a comedy streaming service. Brennan Lee Mulligan's a comedian there, and he does a video series where he plays the role of CEOs of various companies, doing a little, PSA for the company, and it always goes terribly. And I think maybe one of the best ones he's done is as the CEO of GoFundMe. Here's how it starts.
Hello, America. My name is Dan Spoon, and I'm the CEO of GoFundMe, the personal crowdfunding website that gives you the tools you need to achieve your dreams. Honeymoons, dream vacations, the world was your oyster. That vision of the company vanished almost immediately as we instead became an unwilling linchpin of the American healthcare system.
It gets real dark.
Yeah, that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, that's the tip of it. He goes through a series of campaigns that are like fun and interesting until he realizes they aren't.
An actual great example of a fun GoFundMe project is Devin Boone, who wants to go kayaking with his friends Tad and Steve. Devin writes, "Sup, bros? Me, Tad, and Steve all finna hit those tasty waves out at this year's SurfCon. Our plan is to paddle out to sea, eventually crossing the border into Mexico. None of us have passports, and Steve's pancreatic cancer has unfortunately metastasized. He can't afford surgery in the States, but if me and John sell our kidneys to the Sinaloa cartel..." Oh.
Do you want us to keep rolling? Are you okay? Do you need a minute?
I run a website that hosts popularity contests where if you lose, you die. Would you be doing all right?
God, it's so dark. It's so true. That's why it hits.
Except that the CEO actually feels that way. That's the part that's probably not true.
Cognitive dissonance, right? Like,
I don't know. You think alone at night with his thoughts? I don't know. He might be there somewhere.
We could hope.
Yeah.
The deserving ones will get the funding they need, Amanda.
Yeah.
I think that's how he sleeps at night.
And can I just say, like, I hope this doesn't come across as judging anyone for doing this, because this is necessary. And that's what
Oh,
we're
yeah,
trying
no.
to highlight. Like, this
absolutely.
is sadly a necessary thing that needs to happen. And, until we overhaul the system, this is how it's going to be.
Yeah. No, you're totally right. And actually, the last clip of that makes that point well.
Our new online newsletter, Sickness is Storytelling, How to Make Your Cancer More Marketable, will give you tips and tricks to have your life's greatest misfortune go viral. I can't do this anymore. I actually can't do this anymore. Also, please consider donating to our staff's GoFundMe, entitled Our Funky Little Kickstarter Turned into a Dystopian Pressure Valve That, while helpful, is only delaying our collective reckoning with our society's pathological hatred of the working class, and now we all need therapy.
Yep.
Jesus. Oh, it's too on the nose.
Yeah.
Think I would love it no matter what, but the fact that it's Brennan, like,
Oh, yeah.
I don't know, his humor, look up the board game Capitalism, explain the rules. Oh my gosh. Yeah. This is tragically accurate.
So, in conclusion, have the right debates, not the distraction debates. Aim higher, look for systemic solutions, because they're the only ones that actually work and don't have horrific side effects that tear society apart at the seams. That's my take.
Can we also add, like, instead of worrying about what others don't deserve, start worrying more about what you deserve? Like, you deserve healthcare too. It's okay. Jesus.
And if you have any thoughts about what you or anyone else deserves, you can send us a message at 202-999-3991. Send in an email to j@bestofleft.com or find us on Signal at bestofleft.01. Thanks for listening, and remember that this is all really happening, so continue to be decent, act like what you do and say matters, and do what matters most.